Hi, and welcome to week 4 of our 5 weeks together. This is the penultimate week, so if you have not read, assessed, and rough drafted your essay for week 5 yet, please do so. The prompt is on the syllabus and syllabus page of Canvas. Now, on to the emerging and continuing revolution of technology. So as we move into this lecture, I want you to keep a few things in mind. First, technology is inherently iterative. That is, you make tools that make a job easier, but those tools are constantly being improved, or at least attempted to be improved. And of course, there's no guarantee that an innovation will be useful or that it will be wanted. A phenomenon that begins to occur in the 18th century and continues through today is compression, though this is usually applied to mechanical compression, springs, pneumatic drives, and hydraulic presses, for example. In this lecture, we're going to focus on compression of time and space. Basically, a large body is contained within a smaller space. Critical mass for our purposes will be used to discuss the adoption of technology by people. Much like Gutenberg's printing press took off but wasn't technically the first time it had ever been conceived, so too other technology needs a certain percentage of the populace, or countries in some cases, to adopt it in order to make it viable. Finally, we'll dip ever so shallowly into physics with an important and immutable law of the universe known as the first law of thermodynamics. Energy is never created or destroyed in an isolated system. In plain speak, this means that though energy can be used to do a job, some of that energy is released into the world, usually as heat, but also as chemical reactions, physical motion, or gases. Remember, physics, much like gravity, keeps on functioning regardless of what you believe or don't believe. As I mentioned before, technology is inherently iterative. In an ideal or simplified world, this means that primitive technology is improved upon to make better technology, which itself is also improved upon to make more advanced technology. A more concrete example of this is trains. Though they started off ungainly and primitive, they morphed into more sophisticated versions who themselves gave way to sleeker, faster, and stronger ones. Unfortunately, technology is not quite like that in the real world. The past is littered with discarded improvements or intermediary steps that really went nowhere. Early traction engines combined with pumps gave way to a bunch of versions of the early locomotives. Those in turn spawned a variety of dead-end technologies that tried to combine the familiar with the new and unfamiliar, such as some early trains that looked like the abandoned love child of stagecoaches and boilers. Think of the types of technology that have failed in your lifetime. Ideas that never really panned out or ones that are past their prime and are no longer used. Let's look at another example. That early ships that appeared in English ports called tugs. In the early 19th century, these tugs were relegated to helping sailing ships find berths in crowded ports. The tug's technology would later be paired with conventional sailing ships to make sailing more reliable. Engines were deployed when winds failed or when the winds were just not enough to get going. This kind of dual hybrid system itself gave way to a fully functioning, self-sustained steamships that used water and coal to produce mechanical motion at speeds in excess of what could be achieved by sail or even those hybrids. But just as steamships obsoleted sailing vessels in the 19th century, by the beginning of the 20th century, leading innovative countries ditched steam for internal combustion fossil fuel ships. So what does this mean for humankind? This is where compression comes into play. We can measure compression in the distance traveled divided by the speed that is traveled to get how long it takes to get from point A to point B. That's how we're going to measure compression. For most of human history, people walked everywhere. The average person can walk on a flat, even ground about 3 miles an hour. This is significantly reduced if you are cutting through difficult terrain, but for our purposes, we'll assume that there is a nice smooth road for a nice 3 mile an hour speed. Riding a horse is not only faster, but less fatiguing, at least for the human. Animal power, whether it's oxen, horse, pony, or llama, was used as a substitute for human power. These animals of burden were used to make travel, for example, more efficient. Thus, a person riding a horse can travel not only about 50% faster, but also for a longer while than on foot. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, however, there came an astounding speed improvement. Mid-19th century locomotives could travel an average of about 30 miles an hour, and that travel was theoretically indefinite as long as they had fuel and water. A further compression jump arrives with the commercial jetliners. In the mid-20th century, a commercial jet airliner can travel at a breathtaking 575 miles in an hour. Like its predecessor, the locomotive, as long as it has fuel and is properly maintained, it can complete its job without tiring for years on end. So how does compression work for you? How does this affect your life? Think about where you are right now. How far away is Lexington, Kentucky? How long would it take for you to get from where you are to that city? Let's take, for example, that you live in Cincinnati, Ohio. Lexington is a little over 82 miles in a roughly straight line from Cincinnati. If you walk, assuming you maintained an even pace of 3 miles an hour and walked for about 10 hours nonstop, it might take you nearly 3 days to get to Lexington. If you were bicycling, and at this point we'll say casual bicycling will be about as fast as riding a horse, so roughly 4.5 miles an hour. If you rode for 10 hours a day, it will take you just shy of 2 days to get to Lexington. Now, most people don't walk or bike to Lexington. Instead, we get in our vehicle and we travel to Lexington in about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, depending on whether you obey the speed limit or not. In this exercise, notice how we measured our progress to Lexington, Kentucky. We measured in time units, not in distance. Regardless of how we traveled, the distance doesn't change, but our perception of the distance changes. We can measure it in minutes, hours, or even days. So, how far away is Cleveland? Would it be about 3 hours? You might hear that in a conversation. You might not hear how many miles it is away. That's weird, isn't it? As technology and particularly travel speed changes, so too does our perception of the world. Far-flung locations begin to feel closer. Eschewing that thought experiment, let's turn back to the real-world history of the Industrial Revolution. These technological advances and the associated compression occur mainly in the Atlantic world, Europe and North America basically, and with varying degrees at later dates in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. The result is that formerly remote lands and become far more accessible and safe to travel to. This increases the likelihood of direct trade as well as the likelihood of conflict around the world. So what do I mean by this? Well, let's look at two examples. The first example, of course, is Japan. In the mid-19th century, Japan was a closed society that had not really progressed technologically for about 200 years, trading only with a handful of Dutch traders on an artificial harbor. The late-stage feudal society of Japan was thus unprepared for when the American Navy, headed by a commodore by the name of Matthew Perry, arrived in Edo Harbor, a formerly forbidden point of entry, and demanded at Cannon Point that Japan open its markets and harbors for American ships looking to refuel and reprovision. The forced and ironically named Treaty of Peace and Amity between the United States of America and the Empire of Japan was basically a crack in the isolated wall of Japanese society. Soon other countries came calling, including England, France, and the Russian Empire, who also demanded similar concessions. China, too, was also a closed society, carefully controlling access to the luxury goods that Europeans could not get enough of. Things like silk, teas, spices, porcelain, and more. A long-standing trade deficit existed between Europe, particularly England, and China, which had few European goods that found a foothold in Chinese markets. In a desperate attempt to break into the Chinese markets, the English traders began trafficking in opium, a slightly weaker form of heroin, and smuggled it into China. Chinese law, and indeed English law, recognized that opium, left unchecked, was a dangerous commodity and both outlawed it. The Chinese government began prosecuting and threatening to execute English drug dealers. This international trade incident sparked two wars between the Chinese and the English. Due to lags in technology, organization, and communication technology, the much smaller English troops won these wars and forced China to allow the dangerous drugs to be sold into their country. Like the American counter in Japan, this loss for China opened the floodgates for other nations who then rushed in to divide up the Chinese territories, including, you will note, the Japanese Empire. So, why was there such disparity of technology? Why was there such an uneven revolution? China, Japan, and some other societies had been affluent for long periods of time, but they never really reached that critical mass needed to spark an industrial revolution on their own terms. Now, some societies lacked one or more important elements, things like entrepreneurship or maybe government sponsorship of innovation, a lack of ready access to coal or iron. Some lacked a need to compress distances or to speed up production. Some had no new raw materials to drive innovation solutions. And of course, some lacked financial or capital investments. Some societies even discouraged innovation or change, surprisingly enough. Let's contrast China and England. England is acknowledged as the home of the Industrial Revolution. It has plentiful materials, a wide colonial network scattered across the globe, and thus it needed to compress those distances in order to administer the empire much more effectively. There was a relatively light government hand and a strong encouragement in entrepreneurship, which allowed investors and inventors alike to take risks. Finally, the British populace very quickly became eager for innovation, modernity, and new technology. Comparatively, China had already been fairly wealthy for quite a while, and though it had plentiful materials, it was a closed society. It was acclimated to having trade come to it, rather than going out and seeking out new economic opportunities and competing with others. Moreover, there was a social disincentive to innovate, a kind of conservative neo-Confucian mindset that saw change as something to be avoided and discouraged, that the new was somehow scary and would disrupt the harmony of the Middle Kingdom. Thus, they had no real opportunity for a critical mass in technology, and thus the technology never really took off. So this seems to be setting up the argument that European ascendancy and Asian apathy were basically inevitable, that history is destiny. But that's simply not true. Given the correct mix of opportunity, breathing room, and motivation, other countries did their best to catch up with the innovation pioneers. Just as the United States was a little late to the game in coming to the Industrial Revolution, so too was Japan. In the early to mid 19th century, Japan had plentiful deposits of coal and iron, but was a closed society that was suspicious of outsiders. In fact, they were so suspicious that when shipwrecked sailors washed up on shores, they were often crucified on the spot for fear of being pirates. One of the treatments that Perry hammered out with the Japanese in that treaty I talked about earlier was the safe return of American sailors. Feudal Japan was also guilty of discouraging innovation and learning, outlawing foreign books and technology. Thus, there was no real opportunity for a critical mass. Now, the silver lining to Perry's abrupt and belligerent appearance was, at least for Japan, that it sparked a change in the society that was profound and extremely radical, in every sense of the word. Those plentiful deposits were exploited and combined with a political directive to modernize the society along Western lines. Society in Japan didn't just open up, it began to import experts from all of these other countries in order to drive their efforts to catch up. Moreover, a Japanese-centric industrial revolution of a sort sparked a interest in the Japanese people and eventually a love for innovation and cleverness, as well as embracing new modernistic aesthetics. So, how effective was this push? Oops. How effective was this push? Between 1852, when Perry arrives, and 1903, less than 50 years, Japan went from a closed-off, inward-looking, conservative society to a contender on the world stage. By early 1900, the Japanese had begun to establish a colonial presence in China, running afoul of the Russians who laid a similar claim in Chinese territories. The resulting tiff between the two resulted in the so-called Russo-Japanese War, and it was a resounding success for the Japanese. They fought the Russian army to a standstill on the land and devastated Russia's Pacific fleet. The losses were so dramatic and so unexpected, it nearly sparked a revolution in Russia in 1905. Fearful of an unstable Russia and a powerful Japan, the United States stepped in 1905 and negotiated a peace resolution to the war. Though Teddy Roosevelt was awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize, it wasn't all altruism. The United States' Navy was actually smaller than Russia's at the time, at least in the Pacific, and the idea of a belligerent and thoroughly victorious Japan boded ill for the United States. As I mentioned before, with technological connectivity comes increased chance for trade, but also increased chance for conflict. Advances in transportation, communication, and especially in medicine such as vaccines and treatments for diseases prompted European powers to begin making claims on African territories. In order to stave off a potentially world-consuming war, the German Empire, itself relatively latecomer but definitely a beneficiary of the Industrial Revolution, brokered a rational, calm method for dividing Africa up. All without African consent, of course, and soon nearly every country in Africa was under the dominion of one European power or another. Interestingly enough, Otto von Bismarck, the man who drove the Berlin Conference that then set off the so-called scramble for Africa, noted with some satisfaction that Germany had basically helped the world avoid a world-devastating war, noting only that a threat facing the world peace would be some foolish squabble in the Balkans. That's kind of prophetic if you think about it. European innovation and technology drove a rapid globalization over the next 2 centuries. The decisions of politicians and diplomats in the 19th century still have an effect today. That globalization introduced technology through colonial exploitation, through trade, and through imitation. Some countries, such as the Ottoman Empire, underwent a somewhat successful modernization project and maintained a small but firm foothold into the modern 20th century geopolitics. China's attempt to modernize were thwarted by Europeans who wanted China to be weak, while Japan was able to punch well above its weight with innovation, luck, and drive. But it's important to remember that the Industrial Revolution touched off a sea change for technology. The pace at which technology advances and is accepted is unprecedented. Just like distances are measured differently now than they were 150 or 200 years ago, so too is the speed of technology. Basically, the Industrial Revolution began to make the miraculous mundane. Think of all the effort of trying to cook dinner in your house, or light your house, or heat it, or cool it if you didn't have electricity and natural gas. Think how easy it is to speak in real time to someone across the globe. Think about how easy it is to get an answer to any question at your fingertips. The cell phone in your pocket today is far more powerful computing-wise than the computers that were used to project the moon landings. We take for granted how easy technology makes our lives. Technology, like many tools, is a double-edged sword though. Just as it makes the miraculous mundane, so too can it make the catastrophic more likely. Technology certainly drove trade, innovation, improvements in health and wealth, but they also came at a huge cost. Societies were trampled and exploited. The most prominent example is the Opium War in China that we covered earlier. And the world's resources were also exploited, leaving many societies impoverished or at the very least dependent upon foreign aid or worse, foreign companies. Pollution has increasingly become more important as a byproduct of the mechanization that our modern world has. Moreover, politics is increasingly driven by technology. Trade and war are flip sides of the globalized coin, and the environment is increasingly important, especially in the eyes of intergovernmental bodies such as the United Nations, as well as health groups. For example, diseases and pestilences that never spread faster thanks to air travel. Whether it's the marmorated stink bug, snakehead fish, or MRSA, contaminants in recent years have set off alarm bells and threatened to devastate entire economies if not left unchecked. Which brings us to the most powerful and dangerous double-edged sword, climate change. On the one hand, fossil fuels are extremely powerful. They are a chemical repository of potential energy for machines. It's light, it's portable, and it's responsible for the generation of wealth, whether through its extraction, processing, sale, or use in many forms. However, fossil fuels also have a downside, including being responsible for the release of greenhouse gases. These gases act as an insulator that traps not just mechanical heat, but more importantly, solar heat within the atmosphere. Thus, they're given the nickname of greenhouse gases. The change in climate has a potential monumental and devastating impact not just on our society, but upon the world's stability. In 2014, the Pentagon released a report that said the number one threat to America's national interests and well-being is climate change. It will disrupt the U.S. internally through floods, storms, droughts, disrupts infrastructure, while making the USA's external interests more problematic as refugees, famines, wars, and national conflicts become more likely. In conclusion, though the Industrial Revolution itself is a relatively discrete period in world history, it sets into motion a range of changes. Technology is constantly evolving and at a faster pace than ever before in human history. The evolution of technology at such speed had philosophers, politicians, and pundits alike wondering if there was a limit to this innovation. Will technology outpace our understanding of its impact and blindside us with unintended consequences? Or can we be like Otto von Bismarck and see where the next trouble spot is coming from? Technology has also compressed our concept of time and space. What will it compress next? What concept that we take for granted now do you think will be obsolete in 50 or 100 years? Critical mass can change a lot in society, not just technology. Social media is arguably as important and profound in innovation as the Gutenberg printing press. But will it be for good or for ill? Will it be for information or different disinformation? Can we keep up with the spread of diseases and pathogens too, or will they outpace our innovation? Finally, remember that the laws of physics are immutable, and that whether we like it or not, whether we are comfortable with it or not, a country's domestic policies and attitudes have an impact upon the entire world. We could decide to be the innovator, or we could decide to be a closed off society and be left to catch up. Historically speaking, which do you think is better? All right, that is it for this week. You guys make sure you do your assignment for week 5, and I'll see you again next week.